Can I ask you for an update of how your week's been?
Well, it's been dark. We had the sun blotted out here by smoke, mostly north of us. But for like 3 or 4 days, it was as dark during the day as it is during the night. So
Are you getting ash coming in?
yeah, yeah, yeah. The level of pollution or the quality of the air was at the worst. It's getting better now, but lots of people have suffered up in Oregon and Northern California, Southern California too. So it's a big problem. But otherwise, um, all is good. I made a lot of ghee yesterday.
Wow.
Yeah, a few gallons of ghee, so that was nice. Learned how to make a new sabji. It was really nice with zucchini, and so I do a little cooking here, and also, but otherwise, my book is in the process of being edited, different levels of editing, Sanskrit editing and some copy editing. Right now, it's going forward, and I'm pleased with the project, with the progress, considering everything else that's going on. So all good overall.
And speaking of your book, Chaitanya Diet wanted to know when you would be sending out some more excerpts.
Oh, okay. I'll have to think about that. I appreciate the interest.
Oh, we're really anxious. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. We have Eric. You want to start off with a question?
Hare Krishna, Dandavat Maharaj. So my question is regarding a couple of pastimes from the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Particularly, I remember a little while back I was reading the pastime of the chastisement of Chota Haridas for the offense that he committed, which eventually led him to take his life. And I was sort of wondering that in the narration, it seemed to be indicating that this was more or less the proper course of action relative to the situation that, and the offense that he committed and things like that. But then in the following pastime, I believe in the next chapter, it appeared to me that Sanatan Goswami tries to do something similar out of a sense of unworthiness, which seems to be akin to Haridas's feeling. But Lord Chaitanya says for him not to do such a thing because the body is God's property and should be used for God's service and not discarded whimsically. So it kind of seemed to be there were two different messages being told. So I guess I was trying to figure out how to clarify or rectify that.
Yeah. Well, I think that in times gone by, there were forms of Vaishnav suicide. And that, in general, has to be understood in the context of the culture and the pervading worldview, as persons at that time are certainly not the prevailing worldview, and circumstances are very different, so they may warrant a different way of responding to circumstances that otherwise may have dictated in that culture as a formation of someone's life. And that in well, not India, but mostly very popular in today's culture, there is some scope for the idea of taking whatever one is dysfunctional, plugged into a machine, and whether you could unplug it or not, and that type of thing. Well, euthanasia, huh? So I would say there were forms of euthanasia within Vaishnavism in times gone by. For example, let's say someone is living in Vrindavan, which is the most, and they're living there physically, but also mentally and consciously in Krishna consciousness, infirmed, and they could be taken to a hospital, let's say, outside of the Dham, the holy place, and there would be a fair chance that their condition would be remedied, but it might not, and they might die in the operation. Let's just say, hypothetically, there's a circumstance like that. So you could find someone choosing not to leave the Dham, but preferring to die in a way, because there is a remedy. Maybe it's not a sure remedy, but they're more attached to the idea of dying in Vrindavan in that kind of environment. But, I mean, Prabhupada's example is interesting, and I was thinking about this the other day, that he had a certain condition that ultimately, combined with other things, brought about his departure. But it would be interesting to research it, because I believe that condition could have been treated medically, in probably in parts of India or with Western medicine, and so forth. But he was not at all inclined to be hospitalized, and he was in Vrindavan, and he had basically resigned himself to leave the world in Vrindavan. And I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if he could have had, extended his life had he gone to a hospital and got the best possible treatment. So it's a choice on his part. And so there's some scope for this within Vaishnavism. And so in the case of Sanatana Goswami, which you refer to the latter case, he had the experience that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had embraced him, even when he had left the Muslim government where he had been employed and had been imprisoned, and he escaped from prison and so forth. So he was not keeping himself, for political reasons, dressed as a Vaishnava. He appeared like a fakir, like a Sufi, something like that. And he appeared he came to Benares, where, I believe it was Benares, where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was. And Mahaprabhu said, with his omniscience, to his attendants, that someone's at the door, a Vaishnava, let him in. And they went to the door, says, not a Vaishnava, this is a Sufi. And Mahaprabhu came and said, bring him in. And then he embraced him, to their surprise, and he told him, go and shave your head, and so forth and so on, dressed like a Vaishnava. So he had that experience of Mahaprabhu just very mercifully embracing him. And then on his way to meet Chaitanya Mahaprabhu again, walking from Vrindavan to Jagannath Puri, which would have taken months, through the Jarikhanda forest, he had contacted maybe he drank some contaminated water in the jungle, and open sores had broken out on his body, and he was afraid that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu would embrace him again out of his affection that didn't allow him to see anything other than the devotion of Sanatana. And he felt that his body would be offensive with open sores. So he was going to commit suicide by throwing himself under the Rath Yatra cart. It's another form of Vaishnava suicide, or jumping from Govardhan Hill. Raghunath Das Goswami, after the departure of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, thought, I'll go to Vrindavan and I'll jump from Govardhan Hill. So these are forms of Gaudiya Vaishnava suicide, throwing oneself under the Jagannath cart. So it's it's a whole different worldview, right? You got to die, and so certain extenuating circumstances arise, and they opt to pass from the world in such ways. I mean, nowadays the world is such that the very idea that you would live your life now for a life thereafter, there's no perfection to be had, no matter how many opportunities presented us. But happiness lies, transcendent to this world, and I live my life in this world to attain that. That's a very probably thought to be an oppressive, approach to life, and repulsive to most, modern thinkers who, in just the world current, where the idea is that the more choices there are, the more possibilities there are for happiness, and you're going to find it, one way or another. Reinvent yourself, 50 or 60 or whatever, 60 is the new, 30. At any rate, Sanatana was going to commit the Vaishnava suicide, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. We're having you're breaking up a lot on your end. I'm just going to ask everyone to turn off their videos. Cameras, not you. You keep yours on. But everybody else, turn off your video.
I think I've solved the problem. Sorry.
Good? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's see.
So I'll just continue. I don't know if anyone missed out on some of the things I said, but at any rate, yes. So I was saying that the transcendentalist perspective is one that, in which it's a given that this world is not the place to find perfect happiness, and so we live in it largely, percentage-wise, with a leaning towards transcending it, where one can find the capital G good, ultimate good, the absolute good, rather than the relative. So anyway, Sanatana was going to commit suicide, but Chaitanya Mahaprabhu stopped him from throwing himself under the Rath Yatra cart and told him he had things to do through his body. He was going to do them, and so on and so forth. So there's a place for Sanatana's thinking, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu at the same time did not accept it, and he's a special person. So, as Mahaprabhu said, he had things to do through the body of Sanatana that he was prepared to do, and so he preserved his life. So that's a different circumstance than the one that you compare it to, of Haridas, Chota Haridas, who was a sannyasi, but in the estimation of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, deviated from his moral commitment in the sannyasa order. And the problem with this is huge, because the people in general depend upon such examples, and when those examples are not there or they fail them, then there's so much collateral damage. Haridas chose a remedy for his deviation as the very, very strict Chaitanya Mahaprabhu with regard to his moral stoutness and adherence to sannyas, which was extreme. I mean, it was extreme for a reason. There were elderly renounced sannyasis came into his fold, who were frightened by the young man, 25-year-old measure of his own renunciation. So he's showing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu the Aishvarya, one of the six opulences. God is defined in the scriptures in one place, Bhagavan, as he who possesses six opulences, all wealth, all strength, all fame, all beauty, all knowledge, and all renunciation. So we see this extreme power of renunciation, which is very attractive, and requires a lot of power in the person of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And he set an example of renunciation, in a sense, to make clear to us that his preoccupation, or the devotee's preoccupation with the love life of Krishna, for example, is not the same as the preoccupation with ordinary romanticism. That those leelas, that ideal is transcendental. So it has a byproduct, a result as a byproduct of that preoccupation, which is uprooting one's self from material attachments, which are the source of suffering. So in competition, so to speak, in the market of ideas, as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's budding lineage found itself with the dominant religious perspective of Gyan, of Advaita, of the Mayavads, where renunciation is not a byproduct, but the way itself. Obviously, if someone is very renounced, then they stand out in the eyes of ordinary people. If they can sleep on a bed of nails or whatever, people think they're spiritual. If they can, another example, I was looking at this recently, of materializing things, like Sai Baba, who passed away in 2011, was a mystic who could materialize things. And the evidence is quite clear that he had that ability to do so. And on account of that ability and a little bit of basic, on his part, Advaita Vedanta discourse, he amassed a huge following. But the following was really coming from his ability to materialize things, which is extraordinary. But his own moral character came also into question, with credible accounts of that being lacking. But persons were so enamored by his ability to materialize things that they could not believe the few they may be, but they were serious accounts of moral depravity on his part. It's harder, the implication is it's harder to be morally correct, if you will, stout, and particularly with regard to the status of a renunciate as an example of the world, it's harder to do that than it is to materialize things. That's pretty incredible. Once I was sitting on a stage with Prabhupada in South India, in Hyderabad, and he gave a lecture, and after the lecture, he asked questions. There were like 40, 50,000 people gathered. It was a huge gathering outdoors. And somebody said, "Swamiji, have you performed any miracles?" And he looked at myself and a couple other young men on stage. He said, "Yes, here's my miracle. These boys have given up sex." I mean, and if he had materialized something on the spot, it would have meant a lot more to people, but they would have been wrong in terms of which required more power. For you to yourself to, let's say, overcome sex desire, which is what freedom is about. That's what freedom is about. If you don't have any sex desire, you're free. And then what to speak of, if you could then generate that or bring that about in others who are close to you, that is an extraordinary miracle. And it's more difficult to do than materializing things. I personally can't do that, materialize things. But it's a particular siddhi that can be, attained by yoga practice. And the various texts, for example, the Yoga Sutra that speaks about it, Bhagavatam does as well, but in the Yoga Sutras, it's presented as something that's not to be distracted by. It doesn't constitute be all and end all of spirituality and so forth. Um, uh, and so similarly with extremes of renunciation, people are taken by that, but it's easier to do those things than to be a morally upright person in terms of even your own status in life as a householder or as a sannyasi, where the standard is stricter and so forth. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, at any rate, he exhibited, of course, he exhibited some miracles. He materialized things as well, but he's God. About Sai Baba Prabhupada said, well, it's good if he can materialize things, but if he can materialize a gold watch, wanted a gold mountain and solve all the economic problems of the world, give gold to everybody. So, and there a guy like Sai Baba was performing miracles, materializing things, and it just makes you think Prabhupada's responsible. Well, Krishna's, look at the accounts of Krishna's, what he's done. I mean, what Sai Baba did doesn't hold a candle to that in terms of miracles. But it's good that he did those things because it speaks loudly to the general people in one sense, but also to loudly against the very idea of materialistic, philosophically speaking, of materialism. So good, but again, the moral character is more important. So Mahaprabhu put more stress on that and set an example that showed that we, as bhaktas, we meditate on Krishna's Leela and so forth, but it results in uprooting our attachment to material existence, which is the end of suffering. And unless you end suffering, how are you going to enter really into the full scope of Ananda? So I'm off on a tangent. I realize that in terms of answering your question, but it's something I've been thinking about a little bit recently, so it comes to mind. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, with regard to Chota Haridas, he was a sannyasi. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he set a very strict standard that really nobody could follow, but he did it for the reasons I'm mentioning. And then anyone who was officially in that status as a sannyasi and had a slight deviation in his mind, which might not have been a deviation by others' standards, but Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's it was, he took exception to that. And that became known to Haridas. And Haridas had such affection for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that the idea that he would displease him, he could not live with. He could not live with the idea that his character was displeasing to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So in a Vaishnava way, he took his own life. And so that's obviously a different circumstance than the situation with Sanatan Prabhu. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, I think the story of Chota Haridas is such that that in taking the suicide as he did, he got the mystic darshan of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and it turned out to be very, very positive. But that said, as I began, these are stories from times gone by, different circumstances culturally and so forth, than we live in today. And while some of the basic premises, like the idea of taking one's life out of a spiritual consideration, or not going to the hospital, dying in Vrindavan instead, or surrounded by devotees chanting a choice like that, that holds up. There's a place for that. But with regard to those particular circumstances, I was with Prabhupada, and one of his other disciples, who was also a sannyasi, asked him about the story of Chota Haridas and whether or not the remedy that Chota Haridas took to absolve himself of his offense, or just you could say, just the way he reacted, as I said earlier, to the idea that he had offended or displeased Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He couldn't live with that. That's a very high standard of devotion. If you cannot live with the idea that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu would be displeased with you, well, you're probably pretty pleasing to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You have to have an awful lot of love for him. And therefore you may do things that other Vaishnavas are not capable of doing. They don't have that kind of affection. So their remedy for fall down, for example, would not have the same consequences, the same results, I should say, as Chota Haridas. but there's a basic lesson to it that nonetheless should be taken. And that is that, well, if you're going to be a spiritual example as a renunciate, then it's very important that you are not a hypocrite. Very, very important. So Mahaprabhu, this is the point he's making, laying emphasis on that. And that point we have to take to heart. But when Prabhupada was asked whether one should commit suicide, Prabhupada said no. Not in our times. We should, that should not be done. Because it's a famous talk that he gave we were walking on the roof of the building in Mayapur at the time. So we see there an example of how that Leela is interpreted in our times by a contemporary acharya with a different solution or approach to the problem at hand, the deviation, than that of Chotaharidas, but nonetheless, the more important principle remaining in effect and being emphasized. So, does that help?
Yes, thank you, Maharaj. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting.
Very comprehensive answer. That was great. Okay, let's see, Brigu. Next. You need to unmute yourself.
Dandavat Guru Maharaj.
Haribol.
I have a question about Balaram. I thought about this around Baladev Purnima, but I'm a little bit late with the question. The question is that when looking for verses and prayers to Balaram, a devotee friend of mine had searched for prayers like this and compiled some into a small booklet or something. And to me, it was surprising that there's not that many prayers to Balaram available within our Sampradaya. And the prayers that are there quite often focused on sides that we don't hear so much about, at least in our Sangha. That is Balaram's kind of violent side, as when he drags the Yamuna, and also on Balaram's being intoxicated and stuttering and with eyes rolling in his head and so on. So how are we, I'm having a kind of a difficulty appreciating these two sides in Balaram. Maybe you could say something about this, Guru Maharaj.
Well, I don't think that I wouldn't characterize Balaram's chastising the Jamuna as violent, and certainly not. There are many examples of Krishna slaying the demonic, even in Braj, and so forth. Although it's said it's the Vishnu in him that does it. But I think that for example, that story is, speaks about the Aishvarya of Balaram. It's also in the context of his so-called Rasa Leela, which makes it obviously very different than Krishna's Rasa Leela, where this overt, I should say, form of Aishvarya is exhibited. And of course, he is intoxicated at the time as well. And with regard to that, I would say that most Gaudiya Vaishnavas find the intoxication of Balaram very, very, very amusing and playful and charming, if you will. I think that Prabhupada in the Nectar of Devotion speaks about different ways in which one will respond to intoxication, and characterizes, if I remember correctly, Balaram is responding to the intoxication in the most appropriate way, if you will, for the most part. Um, um, and I think he's in the Jamuna Leela, he's doing that, but then circumstances arise with the Jamuna that he manifests as Aishvarya, and he does become upset with her, and chastises her. It's true, but how? By pulling the river closer. Didn't really hurt the river, but so that said, you're right in that that I mean, I'm thinking myself, I can't think of a lot of verses of Balaram from the Gaudiya perspective that glorify his penchant for intoxication or establishing dharma, spiritual correctness, and so forth, other than correcting Krishna, which is very charming. But there are some nice verses, and I don't know if your friend included those in the Bhagavatam, where Krishna glorifies Balaram, especially in the 15th chapter. And those don't, coming from Krishna and Braj, they don't involve those features of Balaram. But anyway, your point is you're having a hard time appreciating those qualities. But wherever Balaram does exercise, even outside of Vrindavan, in Dwarka, his Aishvarya, his Kshatriya nature, he's a Kshatriya, unlike Krishna, who's a Vaishya. So he has a different nature. What is the Kshatriya's nature? Well, so a couple of both the things you described are part of the Kshatriya's nature. They have a license for drinking wine or whatever, and for exercising power. But when he does that, for example, outside of, he does it in Braj with regard to Pralambasura. That's a very charming Leela, and I've written about that, and it's been published on the Harmonist, and also Dhenukasura. But outside of Braj, he does. But what he does there, Krishna's also doing as a in terms of his Kshatriya side, coming from Vasudeva. So there's not much difference there, but we do find instances in which, to the contrary, Balaram disagrees. He thinks that the Kurukshetra war shouldn't be waged. It should be dealt with diplomatically, and the breakdown of the diplomacy causes him to not partake in it, and so forth. So I think you have both sides, and I don't think that his kind of exercise of power, if you will, which you refer to as violent, is anything other than that which Krishna does in the name of establishing dharma in certain places, and to a lesser extent, for that matter. The heroics of Krishna are considerable compared to those of Balaram. Even the Braj, that's the complaint of his friends. You're the older brother. You're supposed to be protecting Krishna. And, here Krishna has killed Putana and Shakatasura and that wind, Trinavarta and Agasura and Bakasura, and you've done nothing. You're the older brother. And so they have to egg him on, and they have to pinch his ego to get him in a space to then deal with their desire at hand to ostensibly to taste the tal fruits, but really to see Balaram deal with Dhenukasura, who's prohibiting persons from partaking of those fruits. So it really has to be egged on by comparison. So I think there's less examples of his violence, as you put it, than you find him even from Krishna. And again, his intoxication is something that I don't think it's. I guess it comes in the Bhagavatam only with regard to the Jamuna Leela. But in some of the other subtexts of our sampradaya, our Leela Granthas, it does come out, but it's presented there as rather charming and humorous. And he doesn't typically get drunk and get violent and belligerent and so forth. So those are some of my thoughts on it. But I think that the prayers, as I say, of Krishna in the 15th chapter, at the beginning and glorification of Balaram are very nice. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Some thoughts, yeah. Okay, what else?
Padmanabha Swami has a question, and he
Okay.
wrote it to me in the chat because I don't think his connection's so good. So he says, when defining the attributes of the qualified guru in his Bhakti Sandarbha, Sri Jiva Goswami quotes a verse from the Brahma Vaivrata Purana, which, between other things, mentions that an attached guru only offers instructions, but he does not test the student. Instructions given without testing leads to the destruction of society. So that's
What was that? Needs what?
leads to the destruction of society. A guru who does not test the student.
Uh-huh.
From the Brahma Vaivrata Purana. If possible, I would ask you to elaborate on the idea of the guru testing the disciple as part of his duty towards the student, and how we as students are to properly understand and accept that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if testing is the right word, but if you have a guru that's not detached and is teaching the Siddhanta, then his own example does not test us, so to speak, or does not press us, does not, by his example, push us to a higher degree of letting go, if you will, fully embracing the ideal and letting go of attachments. Whereas a guru who is detached, by his or her example, they do press us. And so I'm not sure that testing per se is the right word. I would say compels the student. So, from a teacher that doesn't do that by example, who's a teacher in precept only, we say, and I often quote it, that in the English saying that example speaks louder than precept. So the example pushes us in ways that the precept, is meant to help us do. But unless we let that precept come into our ears and into our heart to bring about change, then we haven't gone very far, although we may have collected more information. So if the teacher, the guru, is only giving information, academically speaking, so to speak, or just giving the theory and whatnot, then his own example does not test us, does not press us, does not push us, does not compel us. I don't think he literally sets up some test. How renounced are you? And he, has some formula, for that. So I'm not sure that maybe testing is the best word there. That's the way I look at that kind of statement. So we want a guru that is capable of teaching in theory, but even more than that, we want a guru that's actually rooted in whose existence is rooted in the other world, and roots to this world have been pulled up. And there are a number of good examples of that type of a guru who, for example, Gopakumar's guru, his Diksha guru, did not have the time even or the ability to teach him because he was so uprooted and otherworldly oriented. He would pass out and so forth. So it was a compelling example. So we need the example. The teaching should be there too, ideally. We want both. So Shabde Parecha Nishnatam, Brahmani Upashamashram, well versed in the scripture and situated in grounded in Brahman, in a spiritual stance. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay. No response, but I'm sure that was helpful to him. Indra?
Can you hear me, Hare Krishna?
Yes.
Oh, Hare Krishna Maharaj. So I have another like practical question to about the like upcoming Purushottam Mass. And so I was just wondering, what's your take on this? What do you recommend your students to do? Maybe what do you even do yourself? I don't know, maybe that's too personal to ask. Can you just say some words about it? Thank
Yes,
you.
I was asked this yesterday in a call that I do on Saturdays with Spanish-speaking devotees. And I give an extensive answer there. And I think that that will be published somewhere in coming days, but I'll give a brief answer here. And the brief answer is that in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu of Rupa Goswami, the observance of the Kartik month is mentioned as an anga of bhakti. And this is the fourth of 4 months of the Chaturmasya. The Purushottam Mas that you mentioned is a 5th month that comes like on a leap year or something like that. So there's 5 months instead of 4. But out of the months that constitute the Chaturmasya, which is somewhat relative to the climate. In India, for example, it's the monsoon season. It's a time where they renunciate. The mendicants cannot travel readily, so they're holed up somewhere. And so there are certain things that are recommended for them that they do to compensate for the fact that they're sitting in one place to control their senses, minds, and so forth, fasting and whatnot. But overall, the Chaturmasya, if you read about it in the Puranas, you're going to find mostly that the results that are said to accrue from observance of the Chaturmasya are all or largely largely concerned with the pravritti marg, with acquisition. You'll get this, you'll get that within the realm of karma, and so forth. There are some benefits that transcend that and so forth, but it's not the observance of Chaturmasya itself said to be an anga of bhakti, whereas the observance of the Kartik Vrat is. And this is, of course, a month that deals with Radharani and a very central devotee of Vaishnavism. So Rupa Goswami selected this month out and more or less said, observe this month of the Chaturmasya with a complete and very Gaudiya-focused Vaishnav perspective without concern for the others. Now, I think personally that the reason that there is an emphasis on observing the Chaturmasya and the Purushottam Mas when it comes is that in our paribar, coming from Bhakti Vinod and Bhakti Siddhanta chose to observe the Chaturmasya very strictly and with extreme renunciation. He used to eat once a day with his hands behind his back and only as much as he could eat when bending down to eat with his mouth like this. And as soon as he got up, that would be all he would eat. So that's the story anyway. And all he would eat would be unspiced khichdi. So, and you see him some pictures with a beard and so forth, and let his hair grow. And so what's he doing there? He's doing something that I kind of referred to earlier in terms of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu exhibiting a certain standard of renunciation, or the Goswamis exhibited a certain standard of renunciation. And they were trying to show that because renunciation is attractive to people, and it seems to mean something to people, like, wow, there must be spiritual, that these Gaudiya people, with their new idea of being preoccupied with the love affairs of Radha and Krishna, is a spiritual idea, and it results in renunciation in the least it's just a byproduct of it. So they could get credibility, they could, in the eyes of the public, for their new budding sampradaya by exhibiting a standard of renunciation. For example, Raghunath Das's standard of renunciation would frighten the acharyas of the Shankar moth. Goodness, how he could do that. So I think that Bhaktisiddhanta in his time was also dealing with a unfortunate circumstances in the lineage where persons were posing, if you will, like Rupa and Sanatan and Raghunath Das, but didn't have the standard of renunciation. That was not appearing in them. It said, Vasudeva Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojita Janiyati Ashuvayagurakyam Jnanam Jayaratukam. If one does bhakti to Vasudeva, then renunciation and knowledge should automatically appear in them. So if it doesn't, even though you've got some theory, but it doesn't, instead immoral activities are appearing, well, this is a problem. And he was experiencing that there were a lot of examples like that, which was giving Gaudiya Vaishnavism a bad name, so to speak. So he, in his own way, he chose this strict observance of Chaturmasya to frighten people and say that, this should be, if you're really doing bhakti, you should be able to do this without thinking about it. Not that it in and of itself necessarily fosters bhakti, whereas the observance of the Kartik, that's another thing. You can see the positives in that, right? Observing, following, pursuing the pleasure of Radha directly, and so on. And so with the Purushottam Mas. So I think that followers of Bhaktisiddhanta, some of them, have emphasized this Chaturmasya. So you can go to different Gaudiya Mas, and they're really strict. Can't eat eggplants on this day, you can't eat that. This, don't eat carrots. And I personally think that a lot of times they make more of these things than there really is there to be made strictly from a bhakti perspective. Bhaktivinoda Thakur said, I think in Chaitanya Chakramrita, that the essence of spiritual life is not fasting and dietary concerns and so forth. To some extent, those are there are some essentials, but he even reasoned that in some of the Puranas, there was, which were written down at a certain time, cultural biases with regard to diets and were factored into the writing as to what you should eat at this time, what you shouldn't eat at that time, and so forth, which makes them somewhat relative. So that said, that's just my broad take on it. And my gurus, both Pujapad, Sridhar Maharaj, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Prabhupada, neither of them emphasized this or taught me anything about Purushottam Mas and its observance. I've never observed it in any way. So it hasn't hindered me. So that's what I know about it. And I know that, some members of Gaudiya Math look at it differently. And it is, I think it is a little more perhaps Vaishnav and Krishna-centric, perhaps Vishnu-centric than observance of the other months per se or at large. But I'm not an expert on it. And certainly I don't denigrate anybody that follows the Chaturmas strictly or the Purushottam Mas, but not something I've been taught to do as something that's essential and in comparison, for example, to the Kartik Vrat, which kind of like you do that, you did the whole Chaturmas and more. That's the way I look at it. So there may be other ways to look at it, but you're asking me, so that's what I have to say to you for that. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to check out the, I think somebody said in the chat, it's the Shabda Brahman, where the lectures are on. Cool. Thank you. And happy Ekadashi, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, Kanuram, you'll have to unmute yourself. See if he's still there. He was dressed in his paramedic clothes by an ambulance, so he might have gotten a call. All right, in that case, I have a question in the chat from Shamananda. On a recent Swami call, you mentioned that Sri Radha is also absorbed in Krishna, whereas Krishna mind a lot.
Krishna what?
It's a grammatical or a spelling something. Whereas Krishna's mind a lot, but he also gets absorbed in others' devotees. Okay, he's always absorbed in Sri Radha is always absorbed in Krishna, whereas Krishna's mind, I guess a lot, he gets absorbed in other devotees besides Radha. However, in another lecture, you have said Krishna is running around Vrindavan everywhere, completely under the influence of Radha's love, in relation to whom he is like a teddy bear. Like you could take a doll and do whatever you want with them. So he's a doll only in the hand of Radha. He is going to the forest for herding cows. But on the pretext of such, he's actually trying to rendezvous with Radha and so forth. This is the driving force of his life. Okay, that's a quote from you. These statements seem contradictory to me. How can I reconcile them? Whereas Krishna has Radha on his mind a lot.
Well, these are Krishna's own statements. This is Krishna's own statement to Radha and the gopis. You only think of me, but I have to think of so many others. And while it's true that the subtext of that is that he's thinking about Radha, that is not necessarily overtly the case. So it's a comparison. Overtly, Radha's in a pathetic condition at all times, practically speaking, with regard and needs her handmaidens to attend to her on account of it. And we don't find comparatively that she has other what did I say? Other, well, she's not God. So, well, anyway, overtly she is. You could make this comparison. The subtext is yes, Krishna's absorbed in thoughts of Radha. That's there, but it can recede more to the background in the face of Vatsalya Rasa, in the face of Sakya Rasa at times. It's there. Any reminder, slight, he'll go on a tipping point. Therefore, we find him, for example, in the midst of his Sakya Rasa in the midday. It couldn't be at a more higher pitch, if you will, and suddenly he's tipping towards Radha, and the whole Leela goes to Radha Kunda area and so forth. So we don't find Radha in the same way absorbed in other rasas and other Leelas. And so from an overt point of view, there's a difference. Yes, you could say that Krishna's absorbed in Radha. That's ultimately the kind of the hub around which his Leela moves. That's the gravitational pull that he's ultimately drawn towards. That's a fact. But on the surface, not only on the surface, but practically speaking, there are times when that recedes to the background in a way that it doesn't recede to the background in Radha's life and thoughts. So what else? I guess we're out of time almost. Is there another short question? Or?
Yeah, we have one more quick question from, well, I don't know how quick it is. Gaur Govinda Das had a question.
Yes.
Hi, Bulgur Maharaj.
Morning.
So I think about this quite often because I'm a householder who suffers from tremendous attachment to the material world at the same time, a tremendous desire to advance spiritually. And so I'm constantly endeavoring to make my material endeavors the context for my spiritual advancement. And I'm constantly making allegorical or metaphorical allusions from scripture to the material world. One example of that is whereby, how can Krishna talk to me? Well, he can sometimes talk to me through how the universe treats me, or what people say to me at a particular point in time, or how they say it, or whether some message comes to me directly or indirectly. And I was wondering, and it seems to me that I've had, some success at this, and it's enabled me to navigate through my journey. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think that's good, and I would say this, that regardless of whether there's an objective truth to Krishna sent me a message, that guy said something, and I took that in a certain way and made me go in this course, and or this happened or that happened, whether that's objectively the fact, it's kind of part of maybe what you're asking in a sense. It really doesn't matter, in the sense that that type of attitude that you express and way of looking at your material situation and so forth is one that fosters dependence upon Krishna and reminds you of Krishna, makes you think of him. Those things are very valuable. Those create samskars for dependence upon Krishna, which is the central hub of what we call Sharanagati. In the end of the Gita, Krishna advocates this Sharanagati, which is the limb of bhakti. He says, give up everything, Mamekam Sharanam, depend on me. So central to Sharanagati, which is sixfold, is this dependence upon Krishna for my sustenance, for my well-being, for where my guidance, and so forth. So whatever we can do to foster that brings bhakti samskars or impressions that will build up and cause us, as time goes on, to naturally flow towards the devotional ideal and attraction for the practices and so on and so forth. So it's very important. And therefore I say, aside from the fact, who can say whether Krishna sent the message or you're just thinking of it like that, it doesn't really matter. But there are, of course, many examples where that is the case, objectively speaking. Why not? Krishna is involved in the lives of his devotees. Even they're preoccupied with their material situations largely. There are many examples. Of course, these examples are from older times, but there were plenty of householders in those circumstances as well. And Krishna shows himself to be objectively to be involved in their lives. His name is non-different than himself. So let me give you another example. A friend of mine, Govinda Maharaj, who was the successor of Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj, Bhaktisundar Govinda Maharaj, said a nice thing, and I always liked it. He was a Jyotish, to an astrologer. He said the problem with astrology for devotees is that the most important planet is not included in the chart, and that's Goloka. And it said, Goloka Premodan Harinam Sankirtan. The Nam that we chant in Japa and Sankirtan is coming from Goloka. And so that Krishna's coming, that Golok influence is in our chart, in our lives, so to speak. And so whatever our material trajectory, karmically speaking, is, it's altered significantly by that intervention. So as much as we bring in Krishna into our lives by thinking about him, by chanting his name, observing our vows and practices and so forth, then it's a real and living thing. We can't necessarily objectively demonstrate that this person said that, or I had this dream and this happened and that was Krishna and so forth, but why not? And there are plenty of examples of it. Prabhupada used to think like that. He was once said that a man told him in Vrindavan, where he was living and writing, that if you want to be taken seriously by the public, you have to take sannyas. And he struck him in such a way that he felt like Bhakti Siddhanta, his guru, spoke to me, and I must take sannyas. And so he took it like that, and he took sannyas, and well, here we are, as a result of that. He came to the Western world and so on. So I think it's a very, very good, very healthy and helpful.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So good to be with all of you. Time is up. Hope to be with you again next week. And
Thank you so much for
stay safe. Yeah.
time. And if everybody could stamp, I just want to make a quick announcement. Gumaraj, you can leave.
Hare Krishna.
So tomorrow we're going to be trying to continue the Ragvartma Chandrika series with Padmanabha Swami. We're not sure his internet is going to be able to be strong enough. He's on the island and he's in quarantine for 2 weeks. So it may be that we'll do a trial tomorrow and see how it is. But there is a time change, and everyone that's been on the classes, please note this. Instead of being at 12 o'clock Eastern Daylight Savings Time, it's now going to be at 11 o'clock Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So class will be 1 hour earlier for everyone. So please join us for those classes. They're absolutely wonderful. And if you've missed some of them or you haven't been on them, they are on, they're up on iTunes under Padmanabha Swami, along with his Gopi Gita classes. And they're also on Shabda Brahman, yeah. So lots of nectar out there for us. And these classes are, Gumaraj's classes and Padmanabha Swami's classes are giving us life, literally. All right, well, thank you everyone for your wonderful questions and your participation, and we'll see some of you tomorrow and some of you.
What time again? What time again for the class tomorrow?
It'll be an hour earlier. So,
Hour earlier, that's what I thought you said. Okay, thank you.
Where can I get a link for that?
I will send you a link to that.
Thank you.
And Gornarai needs it too, he said.
Okay.
Would you please get a link also?
Yes. Okay.
Can we put it in the chat here?
Yeah.
The link is on.
Yeah, it's on Chaitanya Sangha Facebook. If you have that, the link is on there, just in case.
So you say that the recorded version is on Chaitanya Sangha? Or is it?
The link.
Here is the link. If you can hear me, Archon City, here I'm sharing the link. In the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
So Sri Chaitanya Sangha, you can get it. I will send it to you, Gorgo, because I gave you your email. So send that. Okay, so have a wonderful week, everyone, and we'll see you next Sunday call. Krishna willing. Haribol.
Wonderful.